Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
Anthony Rispo, welcome to the CTA podcast. It's great to see you.
It's great to be on, Michael. Thank you so much. I'm a big fan of your work, and I listen often, so thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and likewise. And, I found you in the way that I think a lot of people found you, or find you, rather, is that you've become rather the social media personality in the realm and space of sociopolitical cognition, also being the host of the Discourse Lab and an independent scholar who has really delved into a lot of research that I would say in my background for my dissertation, which is something that our audience maybe not be fully aware of. I was looking into quite a bit of the sociopolitical research as well. So we had a lot of really interesting qualitative overlaps and interest between you and I. It's a rare experience. I think the first time we met, we sat down and we just started talking shop right away. You know, it kind of delved into that right away. And I find those to be really fruitful and also refreshing experiences because not a lot of people spend time in this material. And I'm curious, you're a Columbia grad. What initially got you interested in this field of study?
Particularly sociopolitical or psychology.
Sociopolitical and psychology, kind of the merger of the two. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something that I can't, it's like an itch. You can't just get away. I can't get away from it. I always try to think about, well, is this really the route for me? Because, some of the, just to add a little bit of a side note before I go into that, answering that question, there's a lot of problems with the research methodology in social psychology. In any research methodology that you're going to find hiccups, but, the way that attitudes are measured, the way that implicit bias is measured, sampling, and it can be very messy. But when you really sift through, and maybe you found this to be true too, you dig down to something epistemologically interesting, something that really just makes sense and answers a whole boatload of questions. At least guides you toward asking better questions about the things you're interested in, like race dynamics, socioeconomic dynamics, and how they affect people psychologically, their voting habits and stuff like that. So I'm just so pulled into it because of the psychological aspect, because politics is a psychological and very personal, and not only just community driven, but very much so anchored in the person. So that's what pulls me into that domain of research or scholarship. I think also I'm a little bit of a rebel. I always have been a little bit that way. When I see that there's a kind of like a wholesale problem with something that's pervasive in a particular modality or system, or I can't help but to want to break it apart and understand it better and see where the hiccups are. And in sociopolitical research, like I was kind of alluding to before, you have certain conclusions about various issues. I guess an example, we were just talking about this before we started recording, talking about microaggressions, for instance, how the premises are essentially invalid. The starting point for the microaggression literature is that a harm was done to a person, and how do we know this? Well, because they perceived it, they felt it, and so therefore it is true. So sort of this inside-out thinking right away, and they use this as evidence, as sort of an assumption starting point from which they derive their hypotheses. And then from there on, the downstream effect is pretty simple when it comes to research. Then you go through the method, and then boom, your conclusions, sort of circular reasoning. Oh yes, that's right. You were hurt and it's their fault. And it's because of your race, and so now the thing that makes it interesting to me is not just the fact that we're looking at things from that, again, sociopolitical, individual meets community lens, and how interesting it is to understand voting behavior and how people think and how people fit on in terms of symmetry, the political symmetry of left and right. But now there's a problem. How much of this is actually measuring what I'm finding to be interesting? And you go in and you see that, well, actually, probably what you're seeing is a lot of invalid measurements and probably a lot of invalid conclusions as a result. And so I kind of like to go in there and understand where that invalidity is coming from, and so you you have to go into theory. You then have to go into critical theory. You have to go into Fanon. You have to go into how the psychodynamic literature was taken and sort of flipped a little bit around by Fanon and Pierce, right? I think was he in Chicago? I'm going to get it wrong. Harvard, Charles Pierce. I can't remember his name. And just how people, theorists, psychiatrists took psychodynamic theory and sort of made it more racially charged, and how that then infused itself into sociology, and how sociology then then the next step was psychology and social psychology. So it's a long answer, but that's really what makes me interested in that particular domain. The last thing I'll say is I do have interests that kind of dominate that in psychology and neuroscience that make me feel a little more fulfilled, because everything I just said for the past few minutes kind of, I feel like it's a mission and it's something I really want to lean into, but it kind of wears you out, as if you're the only one or one of a few people who have, you have your finger on that pulse. So I don't know if you had that experience, but that's a very long way of answering your question. I hope it was sufficient.
Not long at all. In fact, I mean, I think what you're describing is a philosophical problem of the embedded suppositions that
Yes.
really get pulled into social sciences and social science research in particular, and that you do have to take it down to the level of the context when these things are being written, what kind of, not just, methodologically, the sample or who they're, pulling in to do particular research, but also kind of the time period in which those ideas are starting to percolate and what's popular at the time versus some things have become popular decades later. And then suddenly there's all these embedded assumptions from an anachronistic past, let's say, from yesteryear that kind of make their way in. I often think of, you brought up the critical theories. I think of the critical theories of being along those lines. I often look at it as being conceptually anachronistic, that at one point in time, critical race theory in particular would have had stronger legs than it does in 2025, because the time in which Kimberly Crenshaw was devising these or coming into her formative years, I imagine, instructed some of that theory. And if that made its way into, let's say, more rigorous research, then we have all these embedded assumptions that are maybe from her formative years, but now they're located in the past. They're observations from the past. You mentioned a bit of a rebellious streak.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit. I watched your interview recently with Zoe Booth on Colette.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about, and I do want to go into some of those embedded characteristics and problems within the research that you've identified, and also those more fulfilling elements that you brought up as well in your research, coupled with that loneliness, because I think that can't be overstated when it comes to this kind of work. It can be very isolating and island-like, particularly when you're steeped in it. But
it is, yeah.
You guys had talked a little bit about your past, and that you kind of both had a bit of a political revival within your own psychologies. You kind of switched, I don't want to say teams, but you switched your worldviews to some extent. And I was so curious if you'd be willing to go into that a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. It seems like it's a common thing. You kind of find your people. At least there was this first wave during the pandemic of people like the John McWhorters, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry's, a whole bunch of people who were just dissenting viewpoints coming out against a lot of the critical social justice culture and the hysteria that emerged thereof. And now I feel like there's a second wave to some degree, Trump, round two, where people who now feel comfortable saying things that they thought they never would be able to say. And we can go into some examples of that,
Sure.
what that means and looks like. But more to my experience. And it was interesting to talk about it on Quillette because, I have talked about it a little bit on my podcast, but we didn't really go down memory lane that much in my podcast, really. So I started out in a fairly moderately political, a very, very politically moderate, not moderately political, but politically moderate sort of background culture. I grew up close to New York City, about 15 miles, or actually about 8 miles away from the island itself, Manhattan itself. And I grew up Catholic, was not around anything particularly conservative in terms of viewpoint. It wasn't, they were not vocally one way or the other. I mean, I was little too. I mean, I left that area when I was 15, so maybe I was just naive and not aware of these things, but I just never heard anything political. And of course, this was a little bit after 9/11 too, so there was more of a sense of unity. And if there wasn't, it was definitely underground, right? Maybe you remember that after 9/11, how there was just more of a sense of. Sorry, I'm assuming your age. I assume.
No, I remember, but I wasn't in the same context as you. So
okay,
you were seeing kind of more of a unity around kind of New York area?
I was seeing more of an American unity, just a general sense of we're together and we're going to get through this together. So I didn't really hear much bickering about how awful America was at that time, if you will, like we do now, which is, I think, so upsetting. But anyway, it was just pretty neutral. And I then, during my adolescent years, we moved up the line a little bit, about, 40 miles north. And I came into my own. I made some friends in high school. Still nothing particularly political, but when I say came into my own, I came into my sexuality, I mean, I'd always known that I was gay, when I was 6 years old, 7 years old, probably 8 was around the time I started to come into my social awareness, which is why I love socio-cognitive affective research so much too, because it kind of helps explain my childhood and lots of other things that undergird it. But this just sort of this curiosity lived in me from sort of my adolescent years to understand human behavior. I always wanted to kind of know why people did the things they did, why I was teased, why this, why that, why my family dynamics were the way they were. And nothing particularly about that to, assume was entirely chaotic. It was just a fairly big family and Italian family culturally. So just a lot of questions about why things are the way they are. And so that was a through line in my life. And then, Barack Obama came on the scene, and that was very energetic and energizing and exciting and new for me and for for everyone. And there were lots of different promises socially. And I grew up thinking that, my rights didn't matter because of my sexuality, this very collapsed thinking. But there's some validity to it. Of course, when marriage passed in 2015, it became clear that this is, at least legally a good thing. The religious part and the ethical part, whatever, we can have that discussion. I'm fine having that discussion with people. I don't get upset. But at least just in terms of being part of this society, that was a good extension of what it means to be in a free society. And so that made sense to me. And so I just hopped on the train and made friends that were on the left, and I became someone who was on the left for my late teenage years up to really the pandemic. I was quite vocal about how much I didn't like the right throughout my 20s. I would castigate people. I wasn't like the Mean Girls type where I would go out of my way to antagonize someone or kind of stick it to them. But I definitely had that sort of neurotic, and I've always had that temperament, a little more anxious, a little more high alert. If your listeners will totally understand that for sure. I mean, probably most of this conversation, but for sure that temperament was there. And yeah, so things would set me off quickly. And being in a diverse situation with family members of different opinions, I had family members that voted Republican and voted for Trump, et cetera, didn't like Obama. And it would just completely dysregulate me and make me feel like I was, I guess, worthless. Like I fused to that. And we can get into identity fusion soon. But, then I mentioned something on to Zoe that a story that come time for George Floyd, that time had passed, and we started putting black squares on our Instagram to signal that we were in solidarity with BLM. And I did it, and family members didn't. And my brother, one of my siblings, my brother who voted for Trump in particular, he went out of, he would kind of go out of his way to say why he didn't do it, why he didn't believe in it, and he just refused to do it. And we got into such a major argument. We were actually, one of the arguments was after my niece was born in the hospital, and I'm not proud of that. But I say that publicly because you see a lot of this regressive kind of behavior in people today. Well, they'll go at any length to make, excuse my language, an ass out of themselves just to kind of get their point out. And I did that. And it was after that moment, and there are a few other moments too we can talk about, but where I just decided this is, the people who are closest to me, I'm pushing away for this amorphous kind of community that I don't even know. I remember I was given a BLM sign to put outside my house by somebody from the high school. And the moment I knew something changed in me was because of the kids. Because I at the time I was at home and nieces and nephews, they're very little. We were on a busy corner. Putting the sign out meant, we're in sort of a green-red county. And I thought to myself, I don't know if I should put this sign outside the house because I don't want anything to happen to the kids. I don't want my family to be put into a precarious situation. So I didn't put the sign out. And so that's when things started to change for me. I started to think more just beyond myself. Yeah.
A little bit more globally, it sounds like, in the sense of where you were in all of that in terms of your beliefs, but also the ripple out effect that it could have on your loved ones.
Well, I have a question for you, actually.
Sure.
After having had that intense regressive moment and then sort of coming away, like, is that a pattern that you might see in someone just generally, like going through it and coming out I don't know how to verbalize it, but just having a really intense peak of regressive behavior and lashing out, and then it's subsiding and then having moments of clarity. I don't know if that's something we could.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, if somebody is extremely, let's use the word fused, and there's different ways. There's kind of the jingle jangle problem of the word fusion in psychology. But if somebody's fused to their emotional experience to the degree that they are now so up close against their beliefs, you can absolutely see people act, particularly in anxiety. From both anecdotally, I've seen this, and also I would say personally as a human being, I've seen this in myself and in others. We absolutely can have these eliciting moments where we lose our greater sense of our surroundings, and you just kind of focus and fixate on one particular thing because it is so emotionally eliciting. It's so charged, and that can absolutely spill out of us towards other people. I mean, historically, you might hear people describe that as, complex or some sort of pattern that has been unresolved. But in reality, this happens to us more often than we probably care to realize in our lives. We all can get hot-headed and hot under the collar and then kind of just lose our sense of what's going on around us. And to take it a little bit further, I would say clinically, when I see those moments or identify those moments, we could say the cigar is just a cigar sometimes. We can also say, everything is, I had a clinician say to me recently, everything is meaningful in a clinical context, but not everything is necessarily important. In the sense that it might have greater significance, when those moments are coming up. For some people, depending on the exploration, I wonder what it maybe was for you. It could be a lack of a sense of control. It could be, increased anxiety. It could be a desire to dominate a space because you are feeling maybe powerless in your own life. The devil's in the details for sure.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I've often thought on this as a function of cognitive dissonance. Maybe
Mm.
um, I've thought, people talk about TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, kind of flippantly and colloquially, but I like to think of that not if you take Trump out altogether, and that's the kind of the just a parenthetical here is that that's kind of the trap you get into when you focus on sociopolitical is the labeling becomes too artificial. And I don't like that because what you're seeing, what I think is happening is a huge collision of expectation versus the difference. What's actually people who, just pure and simply, maybe not specifically or for everyone, but I think at least for me, and for many people, there's this intense cognitive dissonance of things are supposed to be this way. They're supposed to be the typical clean cut. We're supposed to have, you hear a lot of people, especially older folks who say, dignity, we need dignity back in the, office, all these terms that personify this old school or characterize this old school sort of politician. And when you have someone who's like coming in, who's kind of reckless in temperament, they can't see past that. And that's a whole other thing to go through. But really what I'm going to get to is something a little more mechanistic and process wise would be, in terms of processes would be, I just think that for myself, it was this intense dissonance of bad stuff here. I'm against bad stuff here, but the evidence is on the contrary and I can't take that. And I don't know what to do with that. And, and so it just erupted into this experience of everyone that I think is bad should be bad, but they're not. And it's actually the people that I've been fusing, that I've been actually, I'm going to tread lightly with the word fuse because we both have really interesting ways of looking at that based on clinical and empirical evidence. So I won't use it lightly, but the people that I attached myself to were actually very punitive, censorious, and exclusionary. And it just didn't make sense that the people who were supposed to be like that weren't. And so that dissonance was so intense for me. And I had to work through it, challenge how I thought about things. And I started to read things on the contrary. Funny enough, I went to just the founding documents of this country, like the general ideas that the founders put together. Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Constitutional Convention, those things. Knowing the history of the country, oh my gosh, wow, as a huge shocker to upset your priors. I mean, it didn't start, we don't have to go back to this, Hannah Nicole Jones or whatever her name is, to 1619 Project to figure out what America really is, So it just started to peel away at the layers. And then, of course, the layers peeled away at themselves when you started to see the grifting behind BLM and all these other activist movements who purported to care about the people that, well, we all were assigned to care about. But in fact, they didn't. I mean, maybe that's a bit of a generalizing statement, but they didn't as much as they said they would. And of course, the vaccines and mask mandates and people dying in hospitals and not being able to see their families. And of course, this is all complicated because this was chaotic time and who knew what. But the more we understand now, as we do a post hoc, the more we realize that people there were not always good faith actors in place. So that kind of stuff bumped against my at the time current condition and really modified my model of the world, of how I felt about the world.
Because you're running up against cognitive dissonance, and if we're using the same definition here, and I assume we are, of just that that internalized expectation about how the world constitutes itself and how it lays itself out, and this internal representation being at odds with either the environment or the perceived environment. And then the elicitation of something like anxiety as a response of being like, I don't know how to sort this out. I don't know how I fit into this, and I don't like this. And I maybe I feel hostile in this moment. Maybe I feel angry. Maybe I feel hopeless or something along those lines. Really running up against that and then exposing yourself to you mentioned a couple familiar names earlier. I was like, oh, the intellectual gateway drugs have emerged, because I think we all kind of have those intellectuals who really, they diversify our thinking. They give us that nuance and that perspective that allows us to pull out and away from, get that 30,000-foot stare of the situation, so you can actually make sense out of where you fit in the greater landscape, as opposed to being like right up against it. And so within that, what I'm hearing you say is you kind of recognize that in yourself and started to expose yourself to competing and contrasting and foundational pieces of literature and perspectives, and that somehow kind of scoped you back out again from where you're finding yourself. Yeah, you mentioned social identity fusion earlier. And I know you wanted to be cautious with the word fusion, but I'm actually somewhat familiar with that literature in terms of social identity. What identity group did you feel like you were fusing to at that time?
Oh, that's a great question. I've mentioned amorphous before because I can't, it's funny because it was a contradictory kind of experience. I never, it's very funny I talk about it a lot more now that I'm doing the podcast circuit, and it's always kind of comical to me how nonsensical this is, because I never really actually identified that well with the, let's say, LGBTQ plus community, or the gay community, if you want to zoom in and pick a letter, any letter. And I just never really felt like I belonged in the quote culture, club life. There's a lot of, I being anecdotal here, but there's a lot of drugs in that life. I was never interested in drugs. Not really much of a drinker. I sound like a goody two shoes now. It was such a fun time, but you know what? I'd rather this than that. And I've seen people pass through that kind of life, and it's just not something that I was interested in. And that's not just for the gay community, but I'm speaking specifically about my experience as someone who could have been part of that community. And I just didn't find a sense of community and support. I found a lot of sorts of agreed. I would say, how would you say? I wouldn't say that any of the characters that I bumped up against were that awful. It's just I felt it was very exclusionary, even though it was inclusionary and inclusive. And I never adhered to that, to the idea that you have to belong to a team. Now, there's a part of that makes sense, and some of it that I find to be maladaptive on my part, because this is also another through line in my life, which I sort of have always been to myself. I'll get back to your question and answer the fusion part what in a second, but this is important because it's a very weird contradiction. It's like my father is Italian from southern Italy, and he loves his football, soccer. They call it football, their team, and my brother too, and they are just gung ho about this team. It is their identity. It's part of their identity. I never could understand it. I couldn't even understand people who love sports to the point where it just is their identity. And that's not everyone, but it's the diehards, right? And that's actually some of that is reported in the identity fusion literature. But so anyway, even my heritage, my Italian heritage, I never could feel like there was this pride that was associated with it. I just never, even with American pride.
No, like baseline collective euphoria kind of experiences.
Right. And there's, I think listeners at this point could probably for themselves determine how that could be good and how that could maybe be a disservice. So I'm not going to go into it. I think that, obviously your listeners, yourself, we can dissect it a little bit, but I think that it's obvious how it could be a good or bad thing, and there's some sort of sweet spot there. And it's sort of a good segue into identity fusion. But for me, I think I really identified more with a sense of belonging, a sense of there's a feeling that I don't have to really work hard to explain myself. And, that was the general theme when it came to being in that particular circle. When I broke away from that feeling, things felt much more precarious, a little more uncertain, felt as if I were on a quagmire, kind of like not sure where to find safe grounding. But it was where I experienced the most growth, because I started to notice that there are other aspects of myself. I can't remember the kind of psychotherapy that focuses on aspects, but maybe you do, or someone listening does, but certain facets and aspects of myself that I just didn't tap into because I
Mm-hmm.
was so adhered to, I was so attached to a specific feeling of oneness that I didn't let other things in, or let other things about myself out. And once I let go of that tight connection with that, like I said, that feeling of oneness with that sense of belonging with that side of, the sort of gay LGBTQ thing, even though I didn't quote identify with
Mm-hmm.
the, you know what I mean, the culture per se. Um, I experienced a lot of growth when I started to, I guess you would, maybe that would be something more Jungian. I don't know, but I just, it was a rewarding experience because I felt myself growing, maturing, becoming me, becoming more
The
of,
experience of stepping out and stepping
yeah,
away from.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah. So that's, it took, I mean, if you think about it, just to rewind a bit, what got me into socio-political stuff and maybe now to get into like what got me into psychology really was a lot of this. Um, in my mid 20s, I was feeling, even though I felt like a good sense of belonging, or, that I was accepted, I always felt at odds. This underlying dissonance, this feeling of, well, I feel kind of captured, but I couldn't put words to it. And I do believe that it's because I didn't allow myself to break out of those closed doors. I mean, those closed walls around me. And parts of me were just wanting to be explored. And I didn't let that happen until all hell broke loose in 2020. And I guess for a lot of people, that was a good time for that dissonance to just reach a certain peak. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, you're describing what sounds like an awakening to me. The process of
Funny
being
enough. Yeah.
funny enough. I mean, but it's right. I mean, the awakening versus the awakening,
Yep.
and it does require that confrontation
Hmm.
for a lot of people. I think that's well established that you kind of have to run it up against reality on reality's terms. I know you've been on Ryan Rogers' podcast. This is a
Yeah.
conversation he and I have
Yeah.
had in the past, or at least a similar one, where as part of being a human being and just developing, you do have to run up against the friction of life in order to grow, to manifest parts of yourself that maybe were dormant or maybe weren't, given, they were a garden analogy, given enough sunlight, so to speak, because they weren't suiting you and they weren't adaptive potentially, is one way to think about it, under the circumstances of getting what you perceive to be your perceived need, maybe belonging in this case, met in some way. I don't know if it was necessarily belonging, but yeah,
Yeah. Because then circling back, thinking about it,
sure.
it's like, that moment of that sort of regressive moment, kind of a regression to adolescence, I think of it,
Mm,
when I kicked and screamed and literally threw a little bit of a tantrum when I was 30 at my brother, um, over the George Floyd thing. Because this is interesting to sort of piggyback on what you said there, because in terms of growth, maybe, and I think it's fair to say that I wasn't getting what I felt I needed from the group I was part of, whatever the group was at the time
mm,
during the pandemic, because it was external. It was not, it was abstract. It wasn't actually it wasn't there for me. It wasn't serving a greater purpose in my life other than this external kind of thing. I mentioned amorphous again. That's what it felt like. It was just this thing I had to oblige to, like these prescripts, and you have to put a square up, you have to put a sign out, we have to sign a petition to get the Indians mascot taken away, which, by the way, the local tribes were like, why are you doing that? And um so it just all felt like going, kind of circling back to the dissonance and the feeling of, community, not getting that, and then having it right in front of me but then repudiating it, pushing against the thing that would be sufficient for me, which was were the people I was fighting. And so like kind of lashing out at them, displacing all that anger on them, all that tension I was feeling about what was around me and what I was latching on to, and just throwing it their way, the people who mattered the most their way, and then just reaching a peak of dissonance, and then finally it's subsiding and saying, you guys are the people in my life that matter to me. And you know what? I think what matters the most is to build my relationship with you, regardless of your views, and and that's the sign of maturity. That's the sign of perspective taking, of good perspective, of socio-cognitive, I would say, health. I don't know if that's really a proper way of saying it, but just being socio-cognitively in good standing and being able to be in dissonance with others, and
And
to
still love them.
and still love them. Exactly. And so that I think, coming full circle, I think that's what happened to me. I can't say for sure for anyone else, but I do kind of think, and I'm curious what you think, just psychologically, just I think that is kind of what we're seeing. It's yet to be studied. I think there's a whole there's a cohort of people. It's just like waiting to be studied. The people who moved from the left to the wherever they are now, or I don't even know if you want to put. I don't even think it's putting political names to it or titles, but just that level of dissonance to this level of clarity. That I think has to be studied. That would be so cool. I don't know.
Absolutely. And you
Yeah.
spoke to it earlier in the conversation, which was, the getting the constructs right. I've often
Right.
found, I mean, I think the disclaimer at the beginning of my dissertation was, I am not going to be able to perfectly encapsulate every part of the political spectrum, assuming it's a spectrum at all, in order to
Right.
have this conversation with every possible label available to me. In
That's a good
order to,
disclaimer.
I can't
Yeah.
appease everyone. It's just not
Yeah.
possible. I'd be writing for the rest of my life, just trying to do that alone, philosophically speaking. And
Yeah.
then they'd morph. They'd have a values reconstitution. These groups don't
Mhm.
stay the same over time. And
Right.
now, we see this really weird, and I wonder what you think about this. The fusion with these political groups, it doesn't just have political characteristics anymore. The characteristics are, I had somebody say to me recently that she was talking to a friend and they described a libertarian as a wealthy white male.
Hmm.
And I sat there and I go, I know some libertarians, and without going too far into it, I know their financial circumstances, both from when they grew up and where they are now. And I don't think that fits the criteria that your friend just, it was a stereotype fundamentally. It was just a stereotype being
Yeah.
lobbed out. And so what makes these groupings at the level that we can discern in research, let's just say, at a correlational level versus like how the culture uses it, that's also like
Mhm.
a huge challenge right now in
Yeah.
understanding these things. I wonder what that brings up for you.
A lot. It is that's why I get frustrated with social psychology, political psychology. It's too up here. It's too a lot of it is too surface level. It's too clickbaity. It's too buzzwordy. And I know, throwing shade at. There's a lot of people that I admire who work in that realm, and of
Sure.
course I'm interested in it. But yeah, there's a substrate. There's something that, and to your point about your dissertation, like I'll never be able to drill down to the bottom and give just a fine detailed answer that appeases everyone or
Mm-hmm.
everything, But I do think fundamentally, in terms of disposition, in terms of temperament, when you look into the gene by environment interaction literature, when you look into the developmental literature, when you go to the bare bones, biologically, developmentally, like I'm saying, I think you can start to see how, just like when it comes to temperaments and um, correlations between childhood neglect and certain outcomes. I think I was reading. And I might be getting this wrong, but I was reading a paper or a whole literature on, what was it? On something about, well, it was theory of mind. I think it was theory of mind. I'll have to correct myself if not, but I think it was definitely around it was around social cognition, development, and it could have been something more specific like affective empathy, or I don't know. But
Mm-hmm.
uh, apparently there's a huge review that explains and sifts out it's childhood neglect that seems to be a bigger predictor of lacking a certain process, like certain, I think, theory of mind, like I was saying, and versus violence. If a child experiences violence, I mean, there are certain neuroarchitectural things that happen in both scenarios that could have compromising effects downstream. But funny that it's not necessarily the kids who grow up in violence who necessarily lack XYZ, but it seems to be a pretty strong effect when there's neglect involved.
Mm.
So I uh, I think when you start to hone in on those like early stages of life from the biological perspective, and how it's not this, especially when you look at the gene by environment literature, like I was saying, there's
Mm-hmm.
not per se a deterministic component where maybe you can't downregulate stress that well. There's a specific, I can't remember what it is. A lot of things I can't remember right now, but my cognitive neuroscience seminar, I remember talking about a transporter gene for serotonin, and how there's certain polymorphisms for certain people who can't. It's compromised. Their capacity to downregulate emotion
Mm-hmm.
dysregulation is compromised because of this genetic profile they have, whereas
Right.
opposed to others who actually have an easier time doing it. They can grow up in a violent household, and
Be
they're
buffered out
less.
by it.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Right.
in one way or
Right.
another.
Or buffered from it. Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Buffering effects. And you can put the same people in a particular environment, but their genetic predispositions will have some kind of effect. Uh, and so the point I'm getting at is that I do think that a lot of what we're seeing behaviorally, phenotypically, when it comes to political behavior, I just don't think that it makes sense to research it at that surface level and those just surface level outcomes. And again, not to like throw it under the table, it just not to make it, anything less than it is. I mean, but you go deeper into those fundamentals, and you see that, well, just like how some people are temperamentally disposed to have higher levels of anxiety, and more vulnerable to their predispositions, and then perhaps the conditions arise environmentally where then that exposes them to becoming more vulnerable to the expression of, like, I don't know, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, or, borderline personality disorder, when you really get really psychopathological, psychiatric, or maybe they just like have a constellation of traits that, taken together, when you mix them with another environment, they can become more antagonistic, so
Mm-hmm.
I just think, and then birds of a feather flock together, and so you're kind of a little more antagonistic. Okay, then you cohere to some kind of um you know general objective in life that you think gives you meaning. And it's just so much more complicated
You're
than
describing the infinite variation,
the
and this is what
infinite yeah, right.
clinicians used to know. We used to, before we
Oh,
started mandating that we look at diverse factors, that were prescribed diverse factors. We
oh,
knew, and we still know this, but we knew that we were supposed to take time at the individual level to be really good phenomenologists and understand we used to talk about diathesis stress, basically where predisposition meets opportunity in life is one way to look at it, where you have this natural genetic predisposition, but maybe at juncture A through C, you are vulnerable for that disposition to present itself under certain circumstances, violence, neglect, what have you.
right.
But then maybe D through, I don't know, G,
Mm-hmm.
you don't have that for some reason. Or suddenly maybe you've developed the faculties that are required to buffer you out from those stressors in the first place. But then maybe you fast forward again to another developmental juncture and you're vulnerable again.
Right.
It's very theoretical at the end of the day, but what we're supposed to be doing is tracking that with people. And I think
Yeah.
that's always been
Wow.
the disconnect and the difficulty between getting sociology and psychology to speak. Now,
Yeah.
psychology took in this weird strain of pseudo social theory.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
said this has the explanatory power just to bridge that divide. But honestly, I've often thought about it as an attempt to reduce that cognitive dissonance we were talking about before
Oh,
between not knowing how
totally.
to reconcile the levels, the micro versus the macro. And it's like, I understand that makes you uncomfortable. That's probably okay. We're not supposed to really fine tune the mechanics of the human being down to the point where we know every granular detail of every possibility. But, we have to be responsible with the variation. Now, to me, I mean, you were bringing up kind of the phenomenological level of this.
Oh, entirely. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is where it gets very challenging. Absolutely.
So you said that this was a practice broadly speaking. I mean, you didn't say that verbatim, but that's what I got from it. Like this was sort of a practice for the clinician to look at things from that vantage point versus now we're in like what's it like now? I mean, when it comes to assessing a person or assessing along with a person, like what's that like now?
It was, I would say, not only was it a practice, not only was it something we were educated to know about and be aware about, that we need to take in the contextual nuance of a person's development to understand why whatever, lack of a better term, pathology or presenting concern is making itself known in a therapeutic setting, right? Why they're coming in. What's the problem? What do they think the problem is? But it was a sensibility. It was a philosophical disposition. And with that, I would argue, was the disposition not to assume. You held that in abeyance for as long as possible. And when it came in, you're also taught to notice when it comes in. We got this weird, it's part of why, places like CTA, I think, exist. This group that came in and was putting forth these social theories that were basically stereotypic in the rendering of people. And when you do that, you're walking in with the frame set in advance. You kind of make a caricature out of your client without even knowing them.
Yeah.
And it's a bitter irony that, you brought up microaggressions before, which for people who believe, the microaggression rhetoric, let's say, they are already doing a little bit of mind reading, thinking they know what's inside the mind and soul or even the character of a person in advance. But
yeah. No. I'm sorry. Please keep going.
No,
Yeah.
but ironically, we're not supposed to do that at all. We're supposed to absolutely come from the place of not knowing, emptying our cup when somebody comes in, and then putting the constellations and pieces together. And that's still part of a good clinical interview and a good clinical relationship across time.
And then from that socio-cognitive perspective, building blocks at a very early age when you're 3 to 5 years old, 2 to 4 years, whatever, you're starting to negotiate without knowing it, of course, really what negotiation is, but you're starting to negotiate your parameters within your circle of peers. And, why does this kid not, share with me? Why don't I want to share with this kid? Or, all these different ways of sort of these higher cognitive processes starting to kick in, where we sort of become curious and we're starting to ask, well, why this? Well, why that? And well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe this kid felt that way, or maybe that kid felt that way. But it's not so much that we ask ourselves the question and then answer it. It's that we maintain this curiosity, and then we interact with the person or the individuals that that prompted that question, and we iron it out. We figure it out together. We sort out what it is that we're putting forth as a proposition, and then we think, okay, well, that thought that I had was not true because you've ironed it out for me, and maybe I was wrong, and maybe I was right a little bit about this, and we start to negotiate, and that is the complete opposite of the microaggression research. It's like you said, you basically put down, you put forth a conclusion about what, you have a thought, you have an impulse, a feeling, and someone looked at you a certain way. It therefore means, okay, you looked at me that way, you complimented my hair, and it made me feel uncomfortable, and therefore it means you meant to do that. I don't even know how you can, for me, this is what I always butcher his name, and I'm so sorry. Fonege, from mentalization-based therapy, as psychic equivalence, like the inside-out thinking, the fact that what I feel and think, therefore is. And the fact that the therapeutic, and I'm sorry to say, but as the whole organization, I think, is pushing against this kind of stuff, that your critical therapy antidote, and is that the therapeutic world, the world of psychology, has sort of promoted psychopathology or inside out thinking by saying, you feel that way? Oh, then it is absolutely true. I mean, okay, I'm exaggerating, but it's this promotion of distorted thinking, of actually promoting cognitive distortions. And it just baffles my mind how we could be doing that. And you see the culture. I don't want to do a one-to-one causality thing here, but the culture is becoming so much less socially healthy. Of course, you throw in the infinite variables, like we're talking about, like smart technology and devices and stuff. You can't just be one thing. I posted something the other day about socio-cognitive processes and development is, I feel, so blunted these days in so many ways that people are just not able to negotiate their parameters or to be flexible. They're rigid, and there's
Blunted in what sense?
What's that? Say again?
Blunted in what sense? When you say you feel blunted,
me or just they feel like the general.
What
culture?
I heard you say was that you feel blunted in some way, or maybe you were ascribing it to the culture.
The culture.
There.
Sorry. Yeah, the culture. I feel as if the culture is, and maybe this is just. It's a bit of it's a bit of a conjecture, of course, but I sense that when taken together, I think that when you distill, or you sort of break apart, I should say, rather, those processes early on in life and what they mean for our social cognition and being able to get along with others and to deal with ambiguity and to deal with disruptions, and I just don't see a lot of that happening. And we can then look at the political landscape and say, well, I don't see a lot of that happening. That's authoritarian. That's extremism. Yeah, but when you really break it down, maybe what's actually happening is really bad social cognition. And just a really quick breakaway, I want to say, I correct myself. The person who came up with the term microaggression was not Charles Pierce. It was Dr. Chester Pierce. And he was the first African-American psychiatrist, and he joined the faculty of the Harvard Medical School, and he pathologized racism, and he came up with the term microaggression. But he said, he specifically said that it kind of gives a little bit of weight to what I'm saying here about social cognition. I'm going to read verbatim what he said here in his article. It is axiomatic that the more privileges a person enjoys. Now we can break this down semantically, because that's a whole other thing. We don't have to. I'm just saying it's very interesting to listen to the way that he put his thoughts together. It is axiomatic that the more privileges a person enjoys, the more responsibility he should bear to eliminate the process of offensive microaggressions from the confines of his own institutions. What does that sound like?
It sounds like some rough self-defragging work where you sit there anxiously trying to, that's what it sounds like to me, anxiously trying to wrangle your thoughts and be very self-conscious while doing so. I mean, just doesn't sound like the seedbed of something productive. What do you hear when you read it?
I hear the fruits. I hear from that sentiment, which was the first paper to talk about microaggressions. I hear from that sentiment a long tradition at this point of affirmative action, which I mean, we could say at the beginning of affirmative action was useful, but DEI, this sort of mandate that we all ought to get on board and ameliorate the suffering of a group of people, or this group or that group of people, by subscribing to, sort of nothing short of like self-flagellating tactics to, this is the original sin sentiment. This is the everything is everywhere all the time sentiment, that systems of oppression are everywhere I mean, that they affect everything, I should say. Systems of oppression affect everything and every pore of society, which I find to be, I said this once before, and a friend of mine got on my case about it because I said it so bluntly, but I find it to somewhat be a little bit psychotic to put forth this notion that everything exists everywhere all the time, and you cannot escape it, and it's something that lives within you, um, and uh, just even the concept of an original sin necessitates this sort of final product of, or end, this sort of idea that you can't rub it off, you can't get it away from you, it's always there. And then what follows necessarily are these lists of things you have to adhere to. And I think microaggressions, that's a great way to sort of get people on board with something that, again, they cannot even really define, but they know that, well, there's a group of people that if I say, if I compliment them, or if I say you're so smart, that I know there's going to be a penalty and a cost. So that's something I have to avoid, even though you can't measure it. So that gets into the measurement validity issue and this philosophy of science issue of these constructs that really lead you to a really bitter end of nowhere. You have no fix of anything, in my estimation. I mean, what do you feel about that?
Well, I know you and I chatted about this first time we spoke, which was, when I was doing my research, I ran across the authoritarianism literature, and that was,
right.
part of my lit review. And it wasn't the mainstay of it, but it was definitely part of what helped me understand the underpinnings of things like wokeism and what we call critical social justice now. And they referred to it as the Loch Ness monster, left-wing authoritarianism, as the Loch Ness monster of the social sciences. I might be misquoting here, but I remember sitting there and kind of just, my eyes glossed over because I was watching what was happening in the schools, and I was watching the reported affiliations of the people who were engaged in, extreme left-wing or progressive politicking activism. And I sat there looking at it, and I go, I don't know how this actually came to be. Now, of course, I understand now. It's kind of like what we were talking about before, the issue of, who is actually doing the research and what are their suppositions in advance of the research in terms of what they're finding. Does it color the kind of questions they're asking? And so does it also color the kind of findings they're getting? And that was my understanding of that problem to some extent. But is this kind of in line with what you're describing right now?
Yeah, I think that, so first of all, the Loch Ness monster thing made me giggle in a political psychology seminar at Columbia because I mentioned it and somebody said, well, that's the Loch Ness. I said, no, it is not the Loch Ness monster. I didn't say it as kind of quick-witted as that, but I wanted to. I was like, no. And I had to, in one way or another, explain that I was in touch with Luke Conway, one of the main psychologists who came up with the left-wing authoritarianism measure, and did a lot of work into create a symmetry. Like it was Costello et al. Who created a different questionnaire or measure. Was it based on? I think one of them looked into the symmetry of the behavioral patterns and psychological patterns, and the other one created a different scale to measure it. I think Luke was the one who came up with the symmetry. He found the symmetry there between left and right, and the paper is entitled, "Finding the Loch Ness Monster: Left-Wing Authoritarianism in the United States." If anyone who's listening is interested, it's by Luke Conway, and he goes into great depth about how it is not the Loch Ness Monster, that you can't just collapse things. He doesn't say this, I'm saying this. You can't just collapse behavior and cognition and the way people behave, just are to something as, binary and plastic as you're on the left, so therefore, and then you're on the right, so therefore. I mean, like, it's messy. So finding that symmetry takes a lot of work, but it's there on the left and the right, and they share there's lots of overlap, actually. But yeah, I mean, I am also, when it comes to authoritarianism, um, when it was Altemeyer, last name Altemeyer, in the 80s, who refined the initial work on left-wing authoritarianism, on the right-wing sort of authoritarian, the right's proclivity for authoritarianism, a la Theodore Adorno in his the authoritarian personality back in the 50s, when he published that, basically posturing conservatives in one way or another as sort of necessarily leading to I'm kind of simplifying it, but leading to fascism. He did the F scale, the fascism scale, and its psychometric properties were awful. So Altemeyer was like, okay, there's something here, and there is, Adorno's scholarship is very useful and makes a lot of sense. Epistemologically, there's other things about it that make a lot of sense, but again, to collapse a whole group of people to this one caricature was nuts. And so Altemeyer was like, I'm going to look into this, and he found a right-wing authoritarianism scaffold, I guess, and he came up with these questions. The problem with the questions in the questionnaire is that they lead you to these obvious answers. If you're a conservative and you value hierarchy or authority, the way the question is phrased about authority is going to make you score above the midpoint of the scale. So you're going to, if something about authority is a little bit more on the edgy side, that someone on the left would definitely score lower on, someone on the right's going to probably score higher. And especially if you double barrel the questions, like give it too much and infuse the question with too many different options for the person to play with in their mind when they're taking the questionnaire, it almost is inevitable. It drives them to that conclusion. And so you see a lot of conservatives score high on right-wing authoritarianism because, above the midpoint, like I said, because that's, generally speaking, conservatives do value authority. And so even with the right-wing authoritarianism scale, you have lots of problems there. Now, with the left-wing authoritarianism scale does now is like I said, it creates a symmetry, and it's Costello, like I said before, Costello et al., who created the scale and it is actually that they created a symmetrical scale, and Luke Conway just showed that there was symmetry in behavior, psychologically. So the scale, it mimics the right-wing authoritarianism scale, and it shows that it's a psychometrically sound, and it shows, yes, there are these same patterns on the left. But then you have to also think, and this is something that I've had to stop at. Yes, it's really good work, and we need that symmetry. But if the RWA, the right-wing authoritarianism scale, has these embedded values baked into the premises, into the assumptions, that then makes the researcher position questions in a way that necessitates a certain type of answer, then it follows that that's going to happen more than likely with the left wing. So they're both equally shaky, but at least they're showing there's something that's being shown symmetrical at this. There's a symmetry there that we can now hang on to and say, okay, there's something there. But whatever's being expressed in the outcome, in those measurements, is something worth drilling into and refining to get to a better final analysis. But yeah, and just another side note. I said embedded values. You talked about something about embedded values too, or putting forth, your presuppositions as almost as true before you position a good hypothesis. Someone to look into is Lee Jussum from Rutgers University, who talks a lot about measurement validity in social psychology, and especially he's written quite a bit about embedded values. So he's a wealth of information about all the things we're talking about.
Oh yes, I've come across Justin's work, and
Yeah.
When I was looking into these matters, I was looking at it very much through the values or the moral frame. So moral foundations theory being like one of my intellectual gateways into that literature by John Haidt, and really trying to understand the underpinnings of the quality of like value suppositions as it pertains to this issue. I think the shortest version of a values definition is a category that describes desirable ends. Something along those lines would be something like a value.
Yeah.
But that's qualitatively distinct from like the process of valuing in a sense, in the moment to moment experiencing of a person. But Justin definitely came up in that literature, and I believe I also saw him on Peterson at some point in the last year or so.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
on Peterson's Jordan Peterson's podcast, and it was great to. And I think that anyone listening who is interested in all the things we're talking about should consider going to that episode because there's a great breakdown. There's a beautiful breakdown of the things we're talking about, and left-wing authoritarianism is mentioned in that podcast.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you a question? Because you mentioned that both the left-wing authoritarianism and right-wing authoritarianism scales that they were using for measurement had an equal shakiness. But in that shakiness, there's something to be derived. And I got the sense that maybe there was a qualitative overlap that can be explored in the sense of making sense of, and forgive me if this is inaccurate or help me out here, making sense of what underpins authoritarianism proper as distinct from the binary. Like, just like what variable, I was thinking big five, but like big five personality kind of came to mind. But is that what you meant by that? Or was there something else in mind?
No, that's actually, yes, that is what I meant. Because I interviewed Conway, was it, oh my God, was it already a year? I don't know, but and he's got a book called Liberal Bullies. I wish I had it near me, but I don't have it here, but maybe I can give you the link. But they both, from my understanding, they both have, it's not bound to left or right content in his viewpoint, and actually from his empirical work, he shows that it reflects, authoritarianism really reflects a motivated intolerance. So to suppress or punish those who deviate from your in-group, to crush your enemy, as it were, just an intolerance of another viewpoint, but on turbo. And then there's also threat sensitivity that was often attributed more to the right, because you had all these neuroimaging studies that came out showing that the amygdala was more active and the insula was more active on the right. But that I won't get into that, but that's reverse inferencing, and in fMRI research and inference is fair. I had a professor, this is a whole thing I'm not going to get into, but I'm just going to quickly side note it, like I have been throughout the episode with side notes, who does social neuroscience, and he does a lot of work on implicit bias, and forget that the implicit bias measure is also really shaky and not good, and forget it. I'm spiraling right now. What I mean to say is that for a long time, this idea that the right was more susceptible to threat sensitivity has been now starting to become more symmetric. There's more of a symmetry there.
Right. My understanding with that was, and I wonder if this is correct, is that there used to be an assumption, it seems like a baton that's been passed on intellectually over time, that on the conservative right, there was a higher disposition towards disgust sensitivity, if I remember that correctly. And then now it seems like with the purity testing within the, I don't know, the woke left, the CSJ left, you are seeing that same exact purity testing, on the other side of disgust being the attempt to purify, to rectify. It seems like you have that same kind of disgust, and that makes common sense in a way, in that we all have disgust responses as part of our evolved and adapted history.
Right.
So why would the social disgust response be disproportionately on just the right side of the scale?
Well, exactly. And then one might ask, like, why are these titles an arbitrary left, right? And they are, because they come from from French way back when, and they don't harness the whole truth. So we just give them more credence than they ought to have, but then we ought to give them. But it makes me think, okay, like you're saying, you see this disgust, this proclivity for disgust, and threat sensitivity on both ends. So it can't just be specific to politics. It can't just be specific. There's got to be some kind of values orientation that leads people, or that is bidirectional, of course, I'm sure, but that then leads people to feeling a certain threat sensitivity to the out group, because, well, what does the out group mean to the in group if the out group is so egregious and terrifying and awful and sickly? It means that they're going to I'm not saying this is truth, I'm just saying this is kind of hypothetical. Yeah. Yeah, and it's, we've got to escape this. I mean, this is not good for our in group. And so I think that that punitive approach toward the other is widespread and independent of whether someone is on the left per se or the right per se. But you have these bitter ends of each that, like, I guess you think of it horseshoe theory, where you come back at the other end. But again, that's why I think that sometimes these political science and sociopolitical stuff, sometimes it just kind of feels too contrived, because now we're digging into the nuance of behavior. And it's like, yeah, you see this kind of behavior, this punitive, threat sensitive behavior on the left just as much, and as you do on the right. And then he also finds like uniformity enforcing, so valuing consensus. And really holding people to it. If you don't conform, then you risk losing you're not socially viable. You're someone that you signal a threat. There you go again, a threat to the group. So
Which is costly, because it's long been contended that the main two concerns for human being is social ostracization,
right,
and essentially death, and that fundamentally they're the same in an adapted sense, in that if you are socially isolated out in the wilderness, your chances of survival have diminished greatly. Maybe it's not zero, but it might be. And
exactly.
that's not a good place for human beings to land, particularly if survival and reproduction, if we take an evolutionary lens on it, is kind of part of what your mission on the earth is as a biological organism.
Right.
And in a sense, it kind of takes us all the way back to identity fusion, because when I was going over this literature, I think we haven't reconciled with our tendency towards Schadenfreude to enjoy the negative experience or even the punishment of those with which we who we deem worthy of it, let's just say.
Right.
And that we might even enjoy that sadistic element. I think that kind of falls into a dark tetrad conversation to some degree. But with identity fusion, what I was finding in the literature was something along the lines of the degree to which somebody is identifying with a group is the degree to which they will experience negative emotions on behalf of that group and have defensive responses, desires to defend that group and that group's behaviors, even if the behaviors are immoral. Even if they can actually run into that dissonance, they can come up with ways to discern why that in particular wasn't immoral. Like they'll rationalize it. Now,
right.
What have you been finding in that literature, and what is really, I'm just curious what stood out for you.
Yeah, no, that's a great starting point, because what I found to be most interesting, and there's lots of that literature is pretty broad. I'm still getting through it. But the thing that I found most interesting and salient and relevant pertains to how college students, well, my experience being on Columbia's campus, seeing your typical left-leaning or progressive white, maybe even wealthy students. There's a whole mix. There's variation there. So I won't particularly, say wealthy and white, but just that archetype that you're
kind of the caricature of it almost.
Yeah, of fusing to the Palestinian cause, and even appropriating. And there was one student who was calling for, we just need water. I don't know if people saw that clip. This one student, we need water on campus, like as if you're not getting water. You're in Morningside Heights, in one of the richest places. Columbia owns like everything in the city.
Was this the Columbia takeover of that one building on campus? Yep.
Yeah. Around that time, and just these students feeling the grievances of the people, or saying that they did, of the people in Gaza, and also just they're a complete mind-boggling showcase of solidarity with a governmental basis of hate that, Queers for Palestine. Okay, this idea that you'd last a week or a few days up in Palestine
Safely
or
in
among Hamas is completely backwards. And so, I mean, okay, so things like that, just like really fusing to the identity of those who live afar. And I always, I still think, I mean, it's this latching on to foreign grievances and problems, especially that one, because they think that Israel is the white oppressor because it's a Western civilization, and it's very collapsed thinking and simplified thinking. And then I didn't understand that. I mean, I understood it as a function or of maybe being young and just sort of misguided, and even potentially erring toward the psychopathological to some degree, feeling like maybe there's some people in this group who are really, really high in trait neuroticism and have problems, again, going back to regulating, and maybe they even fall in the BPD spectrum. And then maybe there are some folks who are neurodivergent to the point where, and there is interesting stuff in the clinical realm where you can look at how people react socially to things with such grievance, and um it's split thinking, and
It stands out, doesn't it? Because it's
it
like
does.
it reminds me of, it's a bit histrionic in the sense
Yeah,
that
right.
there's a theatric element to this. You're
Right.
trying on the garb of another culture in theory. You
Right.
are what? You've come up with a symbolic representation of that group that you think speaks to their cause. You see the cause as being somehow justifiably aligned with your own sense of what righteousness or what you think is right in the world. There's the political theater element of it that's fascinating, with social media, with recording oneself, with social clout, all of
Yeah.
these variables that come in. And it kind of reminds me, and I wonder what you think about this. There's a couple of things that came to mind. On the one hand, the way we've looked at development historically is, if you think about like Erik Erikson, who described identity versus role confusion. This part of your life between ages of 12 and 18, I believe, was the developmental juncture, where you are kind of coming into your own in a way. You're developing that crystallized sense of self, and part of that is kind of a rebellious play for some people. It is a putting on a, maybe you style your hair differently. Maybe you try different kinds of, wardrobes. Maybe you play with different ideas. But with the college experience, I've often wondered if there wasn't a moratorium of sorts on the completion of that developmental juncture, in that it's been delayed, and that people are going to this place where they are being taught to put on these, and historically great. I mean, it's great to go and play with new ideas if they are in fact new, and to run into that dissonance we were describing earlier, and to reconsolidate who you are in the greater network of the world or society. But it seems that what's been pushed off is actually the crystallization process proper, where it's authentic to you, even if it's inauthentic to who you will be eventually. And so you got these young, they're not kids, they're adults, but they are kids in a sense. They're not done developing fundamentally. They're not, even if we were saying people finish developing at 25, they're not necessarily there yet. And they're so aligning with this cause. So in all of that rambling, it's so reminiscent of people going to a movie to me. Of when you go and see a movie and you attune to the main character, or you attune to the character you find most meaningful to yourself, and you start to experience in a simulated fashion the character's experience of being in the narrative that's been set out in front of you, so you can empathize with them, so you can go along for the ride and run the simulated enactment. I almost see something similar here, and I don't know if that's right, to the way they perceive what they're seeing on TV perhaps, and how they're embodying it, and then the social mechanics that go behind the reward mechanisms.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that's so there's the adaptive part of that, right? I mean, there's that
Right.
you're going and you're experiencing the simulation of what could be, of what is for you, perhaps also, and you're identifying with it, and there's this coming together of the self and the other that creates a, you know, it creates a cohesive sense of, of oneness that's still adaptive, and you're sort of organizing. It sort of does remind me of that reconsolidation that you mentioned, is sort of reconfiguring the furniture upstairs, trying to make sense of certain things that are latent or certain things that are held back or not as conscious parts of us. I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting into, but I'm just kind of
Certainly.
tagging on. But where I think it becomes maladaptive and a problem is when you start then bring back to the definition of identity fusion is this incapacity. Well, this is not the definition. I'm adding incapacity, but it's a sense of oneness of you are the group is me. I'm the group is me. And where it's different from social identity, which is I am a part of this group and I get something from this group and I give something to this group and it's great. But I guess what? I can pull away from this group and that's that. And then there's another group that I like and I'm a part of and I give and get from that. But you know, each experience is iterative. It's iterative where in that I'm coming in with something new. And of course, memory is extremely pliable and dynamic. So every time we experience something we've experienced before, it's shifting and changing. And that's great if you can deal with those shifts and changes and that's, I think, a sign of someone who has the ability to have a healthy sense of self. But when it's this fusion of this oneness with something that you don't even know. Like the movie, you're going to come away from that movie and you have to get on with your life. Like I've felt when I go to a movie, which is rare these days, I love going to the movies actually. But when you go to a movie, I wonder if you feel this way. There is that. I mean, I think you alluded to this and said this pretty explicitly. Like there is that, oh my gosh, I'm in this. Like I'm really down with this. Like I feel this. And then you come away from the movie and you still feel a little bit of that, whoa, I remember when I saw Avatar and I was like, I'm in this space right now. And then, but then you get to the parking lot and you're like, what am I gonna have for dinner?
Turns out I'm not one with AWA,
Right.
after that movie. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
What am I gonna have for right. Exactly. What am I gonna have for dinner? But for people who are fused, they are in that movie and they don't, but they don't even have a true understanding of the fundamentals of the main characters in the real world. If they went out to Gaza, like I was saying, they don't understand what it's like to be there. I don't understand it, but I'm just saying, like, this identity fusion is something that, like I said, I'm still peeling away at and trying to understand. But one study that really kind of gave me, I don't want to say goosebumps. Some people say goose flesh, whatever. I kind of think goose flesh is funny, but was a study examining students in the West, UK, and the United States. There were various samples and various studies actually in one big study to show this effect, which I appreciated because it really you look at the variance, you look at all the different possibilities, controls, and it's not just about, your betas and your correlations, but you're looking at how intensely someone scores on that scale, which does matter. Because you can get just another side note. You can get all the statistically significant results between one group and another when it comes to scoring on a scale, and then they both score below the midpoint, which means they don't feel as strongly as the thing they're being asked. So to me, it's like, okay, now we're going to pop it into a correlation matrix, and what is that going to do for me? It's like they both feel pretty similarly, but these people really scored pretty high and who fused, and I'm kind of going a little bit ahead of the game. Let me start a little fresh here. You had several samples of college students who were given vignettes of Palestinians experiencing what they're experiencing, and the Kurdish people experiencing what they're experiencing. And forgive me for being flippant with how I'm explaining this. I think I can give you the link to the study and people can look at the fine details. I think the outcome is the most interesting here. When students were asked, how they felt about A or B, Palestinians or the Kurds, liberal students, left-leaning students felt more fused with the Palestinians and did not feel the same way about the Kurds. But the interesting thing was when researchers modified the condition of the Kurds and applied what the Palestinians were experiencing to the Kurds, the students on the left to the Kurds, showing that it's not necessarily about the people per se and their specific grievance, but rather about the condition, about the it was more about how they identified with the grievances, how they identified with the idea that the Palestinians are being overtaken by this Western civilization, blah, 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 blah. But then when you take that condition and apply it to a different group of people, they felt fused still. It was contingent upon this idea of being oppressed by, all these things they claim to be oppressed by. I'm talking about white liberal students, if you will, which is the West and capitalism and this and that. So it's a little disingenuous when you start to think about it. And it's sometimes, a little hard to say that because I don't want to ever apply or ascribe nefarious intent to people I don't know. And of course, a lot of this is just, again, some of it could be social contagion, some of it could just be their disposition, predispositions, whatever, and they really mean it. Again, going back to the fact that they're young and not as developed. And but when you really think about it wholesale, like the progressive left has adopted this mindset that it's sort of a preset that anything that's Western, anything that's white, anything that's this, anything that's Protestant work ethic, anything that's the Constitution, and all of it has to be torn down, and it's all bad and oppressive, and anywhere it is in the world, it affects people the same way, and we're in solidarity. You can think of fusion as like, I think, a maladaptive solidarity. And that's what that study showed, and it shows that in some other instances too. It's a fascinating study.
Well, it's interesting. It's because I could imagine the circumstances. I wonder if you have some in mind where it could be adaptive, particularly if we had things like war. You had mentioned kind of the 9/11 experience of that unity taking place. Now, of course, were that unity taken to a place of dysfunction would be something like a nationalism that has xenophobia attached to it to some degree.
Very true.
And so I could imagine fusion being useful, kind of like the, what did John Haidt call it? The hive switch, where, we have this ability to kind of fall in line and in sync with the group in a way that allows us to do productive tasks, but that when it goes in the other direction, really unproductive tasks can kind of take place as a result. Maybe it goes into chaos.
Yeah, go on. Sorry. Yeah.
I wonder what you think about that, because it kind of reminiscent.
Yeah, and I think at the substrate, at the base level, I think that's very true. To take from what you said about the 9/11 example, identity fusion around this American ethos, around Americanism, around being an American, and people fusing to that in this country. And I highlight in this country because it's people who are Americans, and I'm not giving a special pass to people who fuse on that end of things, like who fuse to the American patriotism or per se or nationalism. I'm just saying, like, there's a difference between people fusing to something that I'm ironing this out as we talk right now. I actually would like to know what you think. Yes to the American fusion thing, a la 9/11, and how that can be adaptive, and how it can be maladaptive, leaning into the sort of nationalistic. And even though nationalism on its face is not per se an awful thing when you look at it politically, historically. I mean, historically it is, hello, but not necessarily. That's what I'm saying. It's like the nationalism does not equal Nazism or does not equal fascism. Nationalism, that's a side point.
A common conflation. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. But it can get there. You're right. And I think we did see xenophobia in 9/11. We did see some of that. But then you can go down another another spiral back to threat sensitivity and in-group, out-group, like how much of that's a function of evolution, not to give credence to being xenophobic, but how much of it is a response, a threat response. It's like, okay, we have our guards up now. Planes just crashed into our damn buildings. Like, okay, so there's like few sides to this. But anyway, it is interesting to me though, when you have a group of people who fuse to something outside their domain of knowledge. Like, we know if you're an American, you're an American. You hopefully ought to know the history of this country. You know that you live under a set of laws that pertain to you as an American, and that you're coming together in this national solidarity. Is quite a conservative thing, actually. There's two scholars, actually have their book right over here, Respect and Loathing in American Democracy, by Jeff Spinner Halev and Elizabeth Tice Morse. And they talk about this a lot, how conservatives cohere around this national solidarity, this American, we're under the same thing, umbrella, and so it's independent of identity. Outside of that, if you're an American, we like you because you're an American, but the left is more social justice based, so that becomes diffuse and it becomes more outside the parameters of this like American sphere, and so they end up leaking out into these different territories that are not around that one identity. And so I think the difference qualitatively is that the left tends to reach out to different domains that don't pertain to them per se, but it's just because there's some kind of like idea that society is being imposed upon or hurt or subjugated by the West. It just gets more abstract, and it gets pathological, I think, when they lose that centrality of like going back to the beginning of this conversation about losing my centrality of like who's around me in my immediate circle that means the most to me, and who can I build actual relationships with, rather than outsourcing that to groups that are just not even part of my purview. So that's a kind of a long-winded way of saying
No,
that.
it's interesting because
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No. I was just going to cap it off with saying that it's just that yes and yes. Yes, the American fusion is part of the identity fusion literature, and it can go south, and it also can go north, but like the other side.
No, it's fascinating when somebody gravitates towards a group that they actually don't have I don't want to say they don't have any stake in it, because there's a subjective element to what they think their stake might be, I'm sure. But it's almost the problem for human beings is, I look at it the same clinically as to what degree do I become self-focused and therefore potentially neurotic and self-conscious and to my own detriment? To what degree do I become other-focused in a way that, pulls me out of myself and I become, I'm no longer a concrete personal identity anymore. I'm trying to ascribe to the characteristics of the group. And I can almost see that if we scaled it up, the nationalism versus globalization, I don't know, spectrum, if you will, of like seeing yourself as, and I wonder if there's any literature on this, a global citizen versus seeing yourself in alignment with your homeland.
Interesting. I would wonder to look into that too. Yeah.
I'd be very curious if there's anything on that, because, I mean, if we go back to people like Emil Durkheim, for instance, a sociologist who was one of the original researchers on suicide,
Right.
and the suppositions that part of it was the enemy, that felt sense of mismatch between oneself and one's context, which leads to what seems to be, or theoretically leads to, negative emotions that can have a detrimental effect on your psychology. You could almost imagine this group has been taught a set of beliefs about their home environment that makes it feel like it's a mismatch and incongruent with who they have been told they ought to be in order to be a proper moral agent. And outsourcing, looking for a place where that seems to have characteristics that allow the individual to feel that they have hooked into something that makes them feel aligned, almost like they're looking for a place to give them that sense of internal stability. I could imagine a circumstance like that. Trying to almost solve the problem on the fly with you here as well, because it is a fascinating conundrum. Why identify to the point of loss of personal contentment in one's current circumstances, right? Why identify outside of yourself in that way? It's definitely a curious problem.
It is. It's, my gosh. I mean, it's something that I think we could spiral down. Maybe that's not the best. Maybe there's a more positive way, but it can be somewhat of that experience where you're going down all these different avenues. I think that fundamentally the left has this. There's another research literature. I'm going to interrupt myself, but it's called moral conviction, and the seminal papers in 2005, but it lands on the sort of not religion, but how you can look at religion from that lens of moral conviction too. And I just think that when people feel, I think some of the, and this is a new literature for me actually, I'm looking into, but the strength of one's moral conviction really is a huge determining factor on how they act morally, how obviously how they act morally, but how they treat others, out group and group members, and how unwilling they are to budge. And it 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 seems that there's this internal feeling or belief, and it's not just about, oh, I'm gonna lose my social worth or viability or value, and so I have to be careful. But there's like this real internal sense of needing to do something because it just lives within the person, values wise, and what they believe in. And I guess when you think about it qualitatively, I mean, I guess the left and the right, they do care about different things, but we're coming full circle. They express very similar behaviors. And I'm starting to notice a little bit of that on the right. People call it the woke right. And it's hard to disentangle that word woke because it has been through so many different, etymology of
Iterations.
the, and it's like, but I don't know if people listen to or look into James Lindsay's work, and he and others have broken down what woke means really at base level. And I think really what it gets down to is kind of this moral conviction, this authoritarian. We're going back to Conway's work of the symmetry of just feeling motivated to get your point across, even if that means crushing your enemies and I think or being censorious or being punitive, and I've noticed that there are some people on the right who they tend to attach to religion a bit more. And I've bumped up against a few people on social media who are very opposed to the homosexual lifestyle, let's just say, and have outward, just like plain and simply said to me, if you don't repent, you are destined to burn in hell. And these like if then kind of prescriptions or that you see on the left, it's just a different mode of, or a different, not mode, but a different basis on which their argument rests. If you don't subscribe to this idea that you have inherent within you this original sin of whiteness for being someone white, then you're castigated, or you're doubling down. So that therefore means that you have something to hide. And that's the other part about it that I find to be so wicked is.
Well, those are those, if you don't mind me interrupting you there.
No, please do, because I was kind of going down I was not sure where that thought was going. So I don't know.
Those moral suppositions at play. When somebody, I look at it as the egocentrism of world bad, us good. Right.
Yeah.
So and in order to make world feel good, I have to go out and kind of terraform it and change it in some way. Yeah. And not only that, it might be heroic and righteous to do so, but at the same time, when somebody's in that headspace, it seems as though they forget that they're multi-motivational. In that, for instance, with this person online who maybe actually believes that homosexuality is a sin for whatever reason, they can convince themselves, somebody in that kind of headspace, I believe, can convince themselves that what they're doing is morally virtuous and comes from a loving place.
Right.
When in reality, there can be that underlying maligning intention that
Right.
comes with the thought that you can kind of beat something back into moral order.
That's what I'm trying to get at. Okay, that's okay. I'm glad I went down that rant because I wasn't sure where I was going, but that solidifies it exactly. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And yeah, it's interesting to see unfold, and it's hard to be in the space of social media now, which is why I'm trying to refocus what I do to be more process and mechanisms and processes, and because that's where I feel, first of all, more at peace. Second of all, just a little bit more honest, because you're seeing, there's a lot of, it's not as easy as collapsing people to these caricatures of left, right, progressive, conservative, and it's so much more complicated. It's complicated. And, but within that complexity, like we're doing right now, how we're disentangling some of this stuff, you find a little bit more clarity. And exactly what you said there, this person could be very convicted. Like they really believe in this mindset, this, the basis of their faith is here's what you have to believe, and this is what you ought to know, and this is what you either evangelize or proselytize or whatever, and that's your assignment, and that's being a good Christian. Okay, fine. And that in and of itself is not, that on its face is not exactly nefarious or anything of that nature, but it's like you said, there's these multifactorial, sort of multidimensional aspects of that. I think that this person in particular does have an antagonistic bent to their approach. And I do think when a belief system intersects with that, personological framework of being antagonistic, maybe low in agreeableness or something like that, you start to see people who are not just carrying this conviction of righteousness and we need to reign in the day of the second coming, but and get people ready, but who really do want to tear down people who they're disgusted by or don't like, or who they see in themselves and are disgusted by. And I wanted to ask you a quick question about defense mechanism. I don't know what your timing is like with this podcast. I really appreciate that
we've blown past the timestamp, but it's only because I never get to have these conversations, and what? We need to have them. We need to have them. Absolutely. So what's the question?
Well, I don't want to go on too much longer because this could be another conversation about defense mechanisms.
Well, maybe we do this again.
Yeah. I think that would be wonderful. I just wanted to get this one out though, because interestingly, I think we were talking about, or I was talking about how, this idea of whiteness, about having this ascription of, you're white, so therefore you have this original sin. And when we saw this a lot in 2020, when people would defend themselves and say, I don't agree with that. What do you, just as simple as like defending your character and saying, no, I don't have that feeling inside of me. That was evidence for the person accusing of defensiveness, doubling down. To me, that looks like it. What I've observed that as is projective identification from the accuser. That and I was wondering what you thought about this as a clinician and someone who understands this stuff. Like the fact that you're telling me that something's going on, back to microaggressions too, I think is just one whole thing of projective identification. And not only that, but other things too. Just you're projecting on me this intention that I don't relate to. And then when I act in accordance with my values and push against your accusation of my character, you're taking that as evidence of your accusation. And would that be considered to some degree projective identification?
Oh, it might be. It's such a good question. I think that's another one of those the devil's in the details kind of moments. What somebody is displacing onto somebody else in any given moment is always a curious thing, particularly when accusations are being lobbed. I could certainly see a case where that might be what's going on between the individuals. In particular, if it's a part of yourself that you yourself would want to reject. And in the process of rejection, I could imagine somebody projecting that onto somebody else and using them as the whipping post, if you will, for lack of a better way to put it, the object to beat up on in order to almost go through like this, expiation by proxy, this way of getting. That's a really good question. It's worth actually really chewing on and thinking on. So I
We'll
don't
have to do
have an
that.
easy answer for it. No, we'll have to. But there's something I want to return back to. Just I know we've had I've really enjoyed this conversation, by the way.
Likewise.
Thank you.
We'll have to do it
Thank you so
again,
much
yeah.
for everything you're doing.
Oh,
Your
you
social
too.
media presence I think it has people so engaged. It has them learning things and thinking about things in a way that, historically academics would not be able to have this kind of conversation,
know,
or
yeah.
scholars would not be able to have this conversation with the public, but we can now.
Yes.
And I think you've really, your podcast has been a testament to that. Your social media presence has been a testament to that. Something you said at the beginning of the conversation I want to come back to just very briefly, which was you had mentioned kind of the isolation of looking at this research. And I want to point out that, one, I get that isolation, because when you're absorbing all of this, it is like it's like a powder keg in some ways that you're just kind of just taking in, and the world is setting it off constantly with more questions. But I also want to emphasize that you're not alone in it anymore.
Thank you.
And I think you know that. You have plenty of contacts now, plenty of connections. And I hope you can consider us, one of those connections, a part of that network, because we facilitate and we love these conversations.
Absolutely.
We facilitate all the time. And I'd love to do this again.
I would love it too, Michael. This was so much fun. And thank you for that, what you just said. It means a lot. And I agree. I think that the aperture is opening and people are really eager to listen and talk. And I think the sweet spot is being true to this, the science, like the science that's out there that's really solid and that doesn't get out there to the public. Because a lot of these academics, they unfortunately, having been through the system, and you too, a lot of them don't think that highly of people outside their walls, sadly. I really believe that. And not everybody, but certainly where I came from, it's so sad how little patience they have for people with a different worldview. It's so sad. So I hope I can be an extension of the knowledge that I've gained for people who don't get to hear it. So thank you for that. And you guys are astounding. And I've thought to myself, there has to be something before you came online. And here you are. And it's the antidote to critical therapy. And that's wonderful. So
we're out here and we're so excited to speak with people outside the walls as much as we are with the people in them. We got to have the full conversation. Where can people find you? What's the easiest way for them to get either in contact or to find your content?
I think the best thing right now is Instagram at Anthony Rispo. That's in my link tree is there. So just to make it easy on people, just go to Instagram, and
we'll put it down below too.
Yeah, and then I have links to, my Substack and other things that you can. Substack, I'm going to lean into this month a little bit more. So yeah, if your listeners like that you can find that there. But there'll be updates on Instagram. So yeah,
wonderful, Anthony Rispo.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.